John Franzese, nicknamed Sonny, was a legendary figure in the American Mafia. He was born at the beginning of the 20th century and died only at the start of the 21st, becoming the oldest mobster in history. He kept ties with all the iconic members of Cosa Nostra and became one of them himself. Sonny was fully immersed in the life of a mobster and followed its rules without exception, which he proved on more than one occasion. He is rightly considered one of the most resilient criminals who never cooperated with the authorities. No matter how many years of imprisonment he was threatened with, Sonny always stayed true to his choice without hesitation. He would pay for it with prison terms, which eventually ran into several decades. During his long life, this man managed to do many things. He had an affair with Marilyn Monroe, the top beauty symbol of the 20th century. He helped introduce Bob Marley to the world, and he also sponsored the highest-grossing porno ever made in the genre. Today's story is not just a retelling of a gangster's life. We're taking a retrospective look at a major part of the history behind the American Mafia through the lens of one man. He saw how the older guys rose from bootlegging alcohol, then participated in the transformation of Cosa Nostra into the dominant crime organization of the States in the 20th century, and finally watched the decline of his organization, which by now has either gone deep underground or disappeared altogether. So if you're interested in hearing the story of the man who probably most embodies the title of mobster, then meet John "Sonny" Franzese on the other side of the law. In the past, people had to be careful when they went outdoors to avoid being victimized by thieves or robbers. Nowadays, the threat has shifted to the digital realm, where cyber criminals can steal your data while you're surfing the internet. However, you can easily protect yourself by using the Atlas VPN service, which blocks all suspicious links and malicious files, thereby preventing intruders from stealing your data. When you connect to the VPN, your device connects to a new IP address, and as traffic reaches the VPN server, it decrypts the information and allows only legitimate traffic to reach you. Additionally, the Black Friday price cut allows you to buy Atlas VPN at a ridiculously low price, just $1.70 per month, with an additional 6 months included. Plus, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. At a cost so low, you can improve your online security and even save money. That's right, with Atlas VPN, you have the opportunity to purchase subscriptions as if you were in a different country where they were more affordable. Various subscriptions such as Netflix or YouTube Premium come at varying prices in different countries, and with Atlas VPN, you can select the most cost-effective location to make your purchase. To reiterate, it's a limited-time offer. With this Black Friday price cut, Atlas VPN Premium is just $1.70 per month plus 6 months extra, with a 30-day money-back guarantee. You can take this deal by clicking the link in the video description below. John was born in 1917 during one of his family trips back home to Naples. He himself hardly remembered that period of his life, as his parents almost immediately moved back to New York City, where our current hero spent his childhood. The author, whose research I based my video on today, claims that John's father, Carmine Franzese, was a member of Cosa Nostra by the time his son was born. However, Franzese was Neapolitan, and as I discussed in my video on the birth of the American Mafia, the period when non-Sicilians began to be recruited into the Mafia would be later. At that time, if Carmine was connected with crime, he most likely belonged to the Brooklyn Camorra, consisting solely of natives from Naples. In the legal sector, Franzese was a successful businessman. He owned 18 houses, a bar, and a bakery, so John's story is not from rags to riches. He was never in the dirt. But it's also not a story of a father making a fortune and then sending his children to the best schools and universities. John did not lack for anything, but still grew up and studied in the usual environment of Brooklyn at that time. Let's face it, not the best environment to grow up to be a law-abiding citizen. John spent his entire adolescence in street fights. He even managed to get into some underground fistfights. And if you believe his own words, he was an excellent fighter, very rarely losing a fight. It was because of a fight that John was expelled from high school at the age of 14, after which he ended his education. In its place, he was apparently sucked into crime. If you believe the legend that surrounds Franzese, it was around the same time he committed his first murder. And Carmine, who was approached by a local man who said he saw what his son had done, killed the man in the back room of his bakery. Whether or not this is true is for you to decide. However, John, who I will now on refer to by his nickname Sonny, did begin to drift increasingly toward illegal activity. His father, who probably didn't want that for his son, tried to get him a legal job at his bakery. But Sonny found a better job when he turned 18, managing one of the floating dice games in Brooklyn. They were called floating dice games because they were held at different locations each time, making it harder for the police to track down gambling offenders. Around the same time, Sonny was accepted into the Profacci family, for whom he ran the dice games. From here on, I will refer to this family as the Colombo family, as this name is more familiar to most viewers. For those who don't know, the modern names of the families were created after the testimony of Joe Valachi, who named them after the names of people who led them. Actually, Colombo was in charge of the family at that point, but at the time of Sonny's initiation, was still run by Profacci. His trouble with the law started simultaneously. By the time he was 21, he had already been arrested twice for troublemaking and once for assault. In all three cases, he received no jail time. He would go on to have dozens of arrests, and until the 1960s, he successfully dealt with all of them and remained free. Sonny took a brief break from his criminal career only when the US entered World War II, and he volunteered on the front lines. During his military training in the US, Franzese acted as if he had never left Brooklyn. He constantly conflicted and fought with people, and also managed to have a fling with the wife of a major. As a result, just before he was sent to the front, he was discharged from the army as unreliable. Such a violent character would create unnecessary problems. In the documents, the reason for his discharge was given as pronounced homicidal tendencies, which wasn't far from the truth. He would later tell a secret informant who taped the conversation that he had killed a lot of people in his lifetime. And we're not talking about 5 or 10 guys. Authorities speculated that the number of hits Franzese took part in went over 50. Sonny was a very tough guy with an intimidating reputation. As told by people who knew him during his youth and adulthood, more often than not, just a stern look was enough for the other guy to know that fighting was useless. And such a reputation in turn was not created in a single year. It wasn't just rumors that he had killed someone or that he was a member of the Mafia. Sonny was careful to make sure that people could not even open their mouths with a disrespectful tone in his direction. For example, he sold a car to a dealership in this neighborhood, and the owner of the center, when presenting it to potential buyers, joked that they should check the car for bugs because it was driven by Franzese. Sonny found out about it and took it as an insult. First of all, he lived in a decent neighborhood, and not many people there knew what he was up to. Such jokes could raise questions. And secondly, it was a hint that he could not keep track of his safety. In the end, the owner of the center was beaten up by several guys and spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. There will be more examples like that, but I think you already know what kind of guy he was. It was his persona that helped him build his reputation in mafia circles. By the late 1950s, Sonny was considered one of the toughest guys in the Colombo family. So when the Gallo brothers revolted in the family and kidnapped several people, he was one of the negotiators on behalf of boss Joe Profacci. For those not in the know, in the early 1960s, there was a war between the Gallo brothers faction and the Profacci faction. The former were unhappy with the way the family was dividing money and racketeering. They expressed their discontent by kidnapping underboss Joe Magliocco and several other guys in February 1961. They demanded more racketeering and amnesty for the kidnapping they had committed. Profacci promised that they would, but soon after his men were released, attempted to kill one of the Gallo brothers. The assassination attempt was carried out by one of Gallo's main allies, Carmine Persico, who had defected shortly before. Gallo survived, but it still led to open conflict, resulting in the deaths of many people on both sides. About a year after the conflict began, Joe Profacci died. His successor, Joe Magliocco, continued the war, and he was also caught up in the commission coup story with Joe Bonanno. I talked about this in detail in the video about Bonanno on my channel. To summarize, Magliocco and Bonanno planned to kill 3 members of the commission, with whom they had an unspoken conflict. It was like a mafia Cold War. Magliocco relied on a man named Joe Colombo, who betrayed him and told the commission everything. Magliocco was not killed, but forced to resign, and his place was taken by Colombo, who was able to finally negotiate with Gallo and end the years-long conflict. Franzese was promoted to captain as a result of all this turmoil. Oh, and also, in case anyone doesn't know, the commission is a body for resolving disputes in the American Mafia, which includes the bosses of the strongest families in the country. However, after all this time since demobilization, Sonny not only tried not to get killed in the intra-clan war or intimidate undesirable people, but also built his criminal business network. And it must be said that he was just as good at that as he was at killing. From running the floating dice games he started with, Sonny went on to patronize 4 bookmakers, who brought in about $80,000 a week. Franzese provided them with protection from other gangsters, as well as assigning people to recover debts from lost customers. Another form of income for Sonny was usury, unethical loans which, for a gangster, he extracted in a very unusual way. One time, a bank employee who worked in a senior position came to him for a loan. The guy lost big from playing cards, and he urgently needed to find money. Franzese gave it to him, but in return, he asked for a favor. The guy had to ensure that Sonny's people got loans at a favorable interest rate. In this way, Franzese's loan sharks took money from the bank at 5% interest and gave it out on the street at 15%. The difference went into their pockets, and no one risked their money. Sonny did not avoid making money from labor unions. At that time, in a suburb of New York called Long Island, there worked about 7,000 barbers and hairdressers. Franzese decided to unionize them all, calling it the Long Island Barbers Guild. Each member paid a $50 initiation fee, as well as another $10 monthly. I don't think it's necessary to say that the barbers did not receive special privileges from these payments, and most of them joined the organization under threats of physical violence. Although Sonny knew how to act more elegantly in his crimes, he preferred dishing out brutal beatings. So, there's a story of how he beat out monthly payments of $5,000 from one extremely successful chain of barbershops in Queens. Franzese started by planting various pests into the barbershop where the owner worked. These were mice, rats, or cockroaches planted by Sonny's people. And as soon as the owner got rid of them, everything started over again. This went on for a month. Then Franzese took one last step before coming up with his proposal to end all the madness. The owner sent the local boys to get him coffee every morning. Sonny's men intercepted the boys and paid them to take back cups of bees instead of coffee. You can imagine the madness that went on in the barbershop. And the next day, a couple of guys showed up and asked for $5,000 to make it all go away. The owner decided it was better to pay. Sonny also had a hand in breaking into the music business. He opened a small booking agency and began helping unknown talented performers get work in bars and clubs in New York. He had a hand in launching the careers of Sammy Cooke, Johnny Nash, and a female trio called the Supremes. It could also be said that Franzese helped introduce Bob Marley to the world. It was Sonny who gave the initial capital to producer Danny Sims, who found Marley. In addition to the booking agency, Franzese was also an unspoken partner in several recording studios, such as Kama Sutra Records, Buddha Records, and Capitol Records. However, don't think that he was the kind of good uncle who pulled unknown musicians out of oblivion, gave them their daily bread, and then evaporated from their lives. It was nothing like that. Musicians were squeezed dry and left for ruin. They were used to make as much money as possible and then thrown out into the street. And if for this purpose it was necessary to cheat the performer, slipping him a bondage contract, it was done without a second thought. And if suddenly the musician found out about it and wanted to leave, then often said musician was hung upside down from the top floor window or put in the hospital after a beating, where he considered whether or not to continue his campaign for self-justice. The most unconventional activity where Franzese made money was in the porn industry. In particular, he sponsored the most lucrative pornographic movie in history called Deep Throat. It became possible due to the fact that in 1964, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that all pornography, except for special forms of perversion, was protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution and has no right to ban. This immediately caused an upsurge in everything related to porn. It began to be sold on every corner and even shown in movie theaters. And peep shows were making their owners cosmic levels of money. A peep show, if you don't know, is a public wanking parlor. You went to the place, took tokens from the guard, and went with them to a separate booth. There, you threw those tokens into a special machine that played you porn. As soon as the money ran out, the machine stopped working. In some peep shows, porn was replaced by a room with actual girls, and you could only see them after making payment. It was like a 20th century sex cam studio. The big man in this field in New York was Marty Hodis. His peep show establishments brought in some staggering profits. As the authorities later calculated, from one salon Hodis received about $1.5 million a year, which is equivalent to $10 million in today's money. Naturally, he couldn't help but be noticed by the mob. Sonny started by getting to know Hodis and asking him to be his partner. Marty saw where this was going and said no. And then came the psychological terror. First, Franzese's men broke into Hodis' house to scare him. Then, Sonny's men kidnapped Marty's son, saying they were his father's friends. The boy was 6 years old. He was taken in the afternoon while walking off the school bus and returned in the evening with a note saying Hodis should think twice. There were also attempts to kidnap Hodis' 12-year-old daughter afterward, which failed. But Marty decided to give in so that there would be no more reasons to even attempt such actions. Franzese entered Hodis' business on the following terms. Marty paid him $100,000 in portions of $4,000 a week, and then had to pay him $100 a week on a regular basis. Also, Hodis was forced to open all new establishments in a 50-50 partnership with Sonny. In addition to the previously mentioned ways of earning money, Franzese had other ways, but there's no point in going on and on about them. He was engaged in credit card fraud, extortion, protection rackets, and also had several teams of robbers who stole out of everything from homes to banks. You could say that the 1960s were a golden age for Sonny. He was making a lot of money, had unquestioned street credibility, and the numerous arrests that followed him through the years never held up. Somewhere, the cops were paid. Somewhere else, a witness disappeared, and Franzese continued to walk the streets of New York, buy things in local stores, and relax in clubs and bars. By the way, Sonny was an all-star in clubs and bars. He could easily get in the Copacabana through the back door, go into the hall through the kitchen, and then ask to be seated at a crowded club table right next to the stage, and no one dared to defy him. Famous actors or singers, knowing what kind of influence he had, would come up to say hello to him, and female celebrities would gladly share a bed with him. At different times, he had flings with the two main sex symbols of the mid-20th century, Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield. However, the clout that Franzese gained in the criminal world gave not only the above-described advantages in the form of money, women, and power, but also created a huge problem called law enforcement. After all, the bigger the fish, the greater the desire to catch it. By the late 1950s, Sonny was a rising star in the mafia scene. He was both a tough guy who could do the dirty work and a successful breadwinner, bringing in tons of money for his family. And it just so happened that his ascent coincided with the time when the US authorities had a hard-on for fighting the mafia. First, the meeting in 1957 in Appalachian, where the key bosses of all the state mafia families gathered, made national headlines. And then in 1963, defector Joe Valachi testified, confirmed the existence of Cosa Nostra, and told how it was organized and what it did. His testimony was watched by the whole country. After this, the authorities could no longer ignore the threat, and the hunt for the main members of the organization began, and would last for several decades. Franzese was among the first who the authorities wanted to get to. Sonny was on the police's radar because of his frequent arrest, but usually there either wasn't anything significant to hold him, or witnesses simply refused to talk. So law enforcement thought Franzese was one of dozens of small-time racketeers back then. Their opinion began to change when they started looking in the early 1960s to see what big fish in the mafia they could target to weaken the organization. The controlling top families were a given, but for the fight to be effective, they had to go lower. The authorities started talking to informants, and one by one, they began to state that Sonny was one of the most powerful men in the Colombo family. In particular, this characterization was given by defector Joe Valachi and confidential informant Gregory Scarpa. Law enforcers began to check their leads and very soon included Franzese in their unspoken list of gangsters, on which more effort and resources were spent to catch. In Sonny's case, they even went so far as to say that the authorities had bugged his house while the house was being built. I mean, they'd managed to put bugs in the walls. They also regularly went through his trash until the garbage men arrived. And I don't think we need to talk about the constant surveillance. But they never got anywhere. Franzese skillfully evaded surveillance if he needed to meet someone without being seen. There was nothing important in the trash, and he never discussed his business at home or on the phone. He was extremely cautious. Did that stop the authorities? Of course not. As the saying goes, when you have a target, you see no obstacles. They started digging with redoubled intensity. They started arresting Franzese's partners. They brought up old cases where he might have been involved, and so on and so forth. I've told you all this in more than one Mobster video on my channel. When the state authorities want to put someone in jail, no resources are spared. In addition, when so much attention goes from law enforcement to one person, it invariably attracts the attention of the press to that same person. Criminal journalists also began to look at this grim figure under a microscope, which further created an aura around him of, let's say, criminal greatness. All this was felt by Franzese, who soon had to experience what it all led to. It would all end up, of course, in large-scale trials. Before we get to the trials, however, we need to go back in time for a moment. In the 1930s, future mob boss Vito Genovese tried to pull off a murder of a man, making it so that nothing would lead to him. According to his plan, 2 hitmen would kill the victim, then one of them would kill his comrade, and then he in turn would be killed by another hitman. The story was already extremely convoluted at the time it was conceived, and of course, it failed. How it happened exactly, I told you in my Genovese video. Then in the 1940s, the hitmen testified against Vito. One of them was poisoned, but the second one, whose testimony was not enough, was sentenced to life. The man's name was Ernest Rupolo, and in 1964, he was found dead. The authorities tried to blame his death on Franzese. The motive was a conflict of interest in racketeering and extortion. They had witnesses who allegedly heard Sonny order Rupolo's murder and also saw the murder take place. The defense, in turn, found a guy who knew the alleged real killer. Who was lying and who was telling the truth in this case was extremely difficult to figure out, but Franzese was eventually acquitted. We're not getting away from Rupolo though. He had a wife named Eleanor. After his death, she married a robber named John Cordero. He went into business with James Smith, Charles Zecher, and Richard Parks. And in 1965, the 4 began working on tips for Sonny. They later claimed that Franzese personally met with them and gave them instructions. Actually, during the testimony of these guys, who were previously arrested on their own charges, the authorities decided to build a case against Sonny. However, there were obvious inconsistencies in it. The robbers, for example, did not state outright that Franzese was their mastermind, and the defense assumed that the authorities had forced them to add Sonny to their testimonies in exchange for a reduced sentence. Neither did the fact that the always cautious Sonny, who usually gave orders through a few proxies, suddenly decided to work with the guys off the street himself. The trial for the case lasted 5 weeks. The prosecution pressed the point that Sonny was the mastermind behind the planning of numerous robberies, and his reputation as a brutal killer prevented the robbers from telling right away because they were afraid of being taken out. Likewise, the prosecutor bolstered that reputation with past charges against Franzese, which included kidnapping, murder, racketeering, and extortion. The defense argued that the witnesses were coerced into testifying. The defense also tried to smear them as criminals and drug addicts, which was actually true. This time, however, the jury did not believe Franzese's lawyers and gave a guilty verdict. Numerous appeals followed, but the verdict stood. Considering all the aggravating factors due to his past record, Sonny received 50 years in prison. The robbers, on the other hand, got 5 years each. He would go to prison in 1970. He was put in Leavenworth Penitentiary, where from the first days he was regularly visited by FBI agents offering him a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. They wanted Franzese to give them information about the Colombo family's criminal dealings, but he refused the deal every time. In prison, Sonny quickly took a leadership position among the other members of the Cosa Nostra who were serving time there. He settled all the disputes that had arisen between mobsters before and rallied the smart guys around him. When he didn't have to settle business matters, Franzese liked to either play in the prison yard in one of the team's sports or sit in his cell and read a book from the prison library. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the real drama was playing out. His wife Tina and their son Michael, who Sonny had adopted as a child, were trying to get him out of prison. They spent a lot of money on lawyers to find a loophole through which they could revisit the case. But it didn't help much, because numerous appeals from before clearly showed that the court was on the side of the prosecution, and new motions were continuously rejected. The opportunity to change this came unexpectedly. Eleanor, the wife of the robber named Cordero, who testified against Franzese, had a fight with her husband. During this quarrel, he almost killed her. Michael, upon learning of this, immediately sent a man to her to convince her to testify that Cordero and the others had lied at the trial, and that Sonny had never been involved in their affairs. Eleanor thought it over for a long time, but she agreed. In exchange for her testimony, she asked for $50,000. However, the authorities found out about the conspiracy before Eleanor testified. And you're gonna laugh, but she told them herself. When a man was first sent to her to negotiate a change in her testimony, this woman was so frightened that she called the detective she knew and told him everything. He in turn informed the FBI. Not surprisingly, the authorities didn't even believe her when she suddenly began to say exactly what she was previously bribed to say with a cash reward. This, however, did not stop Sonny's wife. She continued to look for ways to get him released, and if not with the charges dropped, then at least on parole. She even went so far as to ask the press for an independent investigation into her husband's case. One reporter named Manny Topol even agreed, and eventually concluded that Franzese's guilt was weakly proven. That's what he told a parole board in the late 1970s. And his words, coupled with Sonny's exemplary behavior in prison, finally allowed Franzese to be released on parole in 1978. Sonny would then repeatedly receive multiple years in prison for probation violations. Almost always the reason for incarceration would be his encounters with other criminal entities, which was something he was not allowed to do. He would get out, do something for a few years, then the authorities would see him with the wrong person, and Sonny would go back to jail. So when I keep saying that he went back to jail, or he's out again, the reason will be exactly what I just said. Once on the outside, Franzese immediately returned to his criminal endeavors. Despite his incarcerations, he retained most of his businesses, which were run by other people in his absence. For the authorities, however, he worked at a Mazda dealership owned by his son Michael. You may know him from the vlog he now runs on YouTube. He was in the Mafia, just like his father, and he belonged to the Colombo family. As Sonny stated, soon thereafter a guy named Sebastian Lombardo came to him asking for help against small-time racketeers who were shaking down his boss, Lawrence Irizzo. Sonny helped solve the problem and then turned Irizzo, along with his partner David Bogatin, over to his son Michael, who went into partnership with them in a gasoline tax scam. I talked more about this in my video about the Russian Mafia in the US. In brief, the crooks created a fake wholesale company, sold gasoline to gas stations with the tax already included in the price, since it was the wholesalers, not the gas stations, who had to pay the gasoline tax. Then they buried up their one-day enterprise, and all taxes were taken into their pockets, rather than transferred to the state. Doing this, the crooks earned millions of dollars a month. The Italian mafioso were doing this in partnership with Jews immigrating from the Soviet Union. Michael engaged in this scam until the mid-1980s, making a lot of money. But he eventually got caught, receiving a 10-year prison sentence in 1986. And that's when Sonny got one of the two hardest hits of his life. Michael made a deal with the authorities and testified against Colombo family partner Norby Walters, who was involved in college basketball fraud. By all means, Michael should have been killed, and as whistleblower Gregory Scarpa claimed, Carmine family boss Persico did indeed write out the contract to kill him. But as people close to Sonny said, he managed to convince Persico to keep Michael alive. Rumor has it he went to the commission, asking that they sway Persico. In return, Michael would give up the lion's share of all his stashed money from the gasoline scam. A life was bought for tens of millions of dollars. Sonny himself lived all the while in his usual routine. He got out, violated parole, went away for a couple of years. Then he did it all over again. When he was in prison, his main link to the outside world was his own son, John Franzese Jr. Outwardly, he resembled his father very much, but in character he was far from him. John was a hardcore drug addict for a long time. He lived in brothels, stole things from his mother's house, and his parents appeared only when things got out of hand. He'd spend a couple of nights there. He'd come to his senses. He'd steal something and then he'd go tripping again. His mom put him in rehab a few times, but he always ended up relapsing. One day she gave him a new Jaguar after rehab. He sold it for a tenth of what it was worth that day and went on a month-long trip to the drug house. When his father began to trust him more in business, John, though he didn't give up dealing, stopped going to the drug house, and his periods of sobriety began to outweigh his time on drugs. While his father was in jail, John collected money from the establishments under his control and had to make sure the owners remembered to pay. Because of this role, he nearly became one of the first victims of the growing conflict between the family boss Carmine Persico, who Sonny supported, and his subordinate Vic Orena, who was going to take the power for himself. Orena's supporters decided to take over the establishment that Franzese was running, and to make their intentions clear, they planned to kill his son. John was saved by his cousin Tutti Franzese, who was also connected to the Colombo family. He managed to make some kind of deal and John was spared. However, the war still started and continued until December 1992, when Orena received a life sentence. Persico remained as the boss, and the remaining men from Orena's faction sent a message through John to Sonny, asking him to convince Persico not to retaliate and to take them back. Franzese managed to do just that, and when he got out in 1994, he set about bringing the family together. Although the war was over, there was still tension between yesterday's enemies. To overcome this, Sonny organized meetings among the captains to resolve issues with words, not gunfire, where he guaranteed everyone immunity. It was his way of bringing unity back to the family. In 10 years, he would be promoted to underboss, but even as a captain, he already had a huge influence in the gang, despite his son snitching. Franzese himself was an uncontested member of the organization, with all the time he had been in prison, and not once had he cooperated. And all the times he got out and went back to life as a street kid doing racketeering, extortion, and murder. However, as it would turn out, Sonny was the only one in the family with an ironclad commitment to the principles of Cosa Nostra. His second son would also become a collaborator with the authorities. In the 90s, John fell back into his old drug life, sleeping in drug houses, stealing from relatives, and begging. His father was in jail, and his mother couldn't handle her son alone. He was eventually caught stoned in a car with an unregistered gun. He pleaded guilty, and since he had no prior convictions, he got a year in jail. During his sentence, it seems that John had time to think hard about his life, because he later leaned back and accepted an offer to cooperate with the FBI. Agents often make calls to those who are involved with organized crime. They just call and tell the person, "I'm Agent so-and-so. Do you think you want to meet and talk?" The rate of those who actually consent is small, but not zero, so this practice is still alive today. That's how John became a confidential informant. At first, he just relayed the information he heard around him. Then he agreed to wear a wire. At the same time, one of the conditions for working for the FBI was to give up drugs. John even went to rehab in a good clinic for this purpose. Sonny, not knowing what his son's changes were related to, thought that he had finally cleaned up and could be pulled into the family business. Except that all those family matters were now being taped and sent straight to the FBI. John worked for the government until 2006, and then he disappeared into the witness protection program. And it's impossible to even imagine how a father would feel at that moment, when his other son became a traitor as well. Sonny even mentored a guy named Gaetano Fatato, who became like a son to him after John left, and to whom he began passing on his criminal knowledge and experience. He'd tell him how to dispose of bodies, how many people he had killed in his life, how to intimidate people, and so on. Not even John was told that much, and this guy had somehow made Sonny disposed to being so open. But, as it turned out, Fatato was also a secret informant, and all of Franzese's words were recorded on tape. You have to agree it's very iconic that a gangster who never cooperated with the authorities ended up with so many guys making deals around him. As a result, at 90+ years old, Franzese was back in court on racketeering and extortion charges. John and Fatato gave authorities enough to put Sonny behind bars again. Now, the trial of a 90-year-old racketeer who personally goes and shakes down a pizza parlor and a strip club was a very unusual sight. Add to that the fact that his own son testified against him, and you get a Hollywood-sized drama. The judge gave him an 8-year sentence. Everyone thought Sonny would die in prison, but he got out in 2017, becoming the oldest inmate in the federal prison system. He spent the last years of his life in a nursing home. He forgave his sons, and he told his grandchildren to stay out of crime. Franzese just believed there was no more money in it, so it hardly had anything to do with remorse. He died in 2020. Neither John nor Michael attended the funeral. This was the story of John Sonny Franzese, the last true old-school mobster.